Hello and welcome to this live stream. Welcome to this live stream. This is the first members only live stream, and this specifically is going to be for all members, both on YouTube and on Patreon for all price ranges. But from next week onwards, it'll be only for the commander rank on Patreon. That is the $25 Patreon subscription. I remember someone told me $10, $25. That is a lot of Netflix subscriptions, and Netflix gives a lot of movies. Well, I'll tell you what I provide, I believe, is worth more than all of those movies combined. This isn't entertainment, this is education, this is news, and so on. You pay $20, $30, $40 for cable TV, and I provide what they do, except I actually come with the truth instead of whatever propaganda cable TV gives you nowadays. So yeah, thank you everyone who's supporting me, and I hope you all are happy to be here. And I'm showing my own statistics that there's no one watching me except for myself. Let's move on to the map. So I thought originally this kind of live stream I'm going to be doing essentially a presentation for like half an hour, and then I'll be talking with you guys. Doesn't look like there's not that many people here today, so we'll have to see how that goes. But for now, we will be doing this live stream live, and I'll be doing a presentation where I talk about the general situation on the front line and the different parts of the front line and so on. And then we'll see what happens then. Also, my throat is dying recently. I really need to go check a doctor. All right, so sorry for everyone's ears. Oh yeah, I can mute the mic every time. I'll do that from now on. So yeah, the situation on the front line. So the general situation on the war right now, I believe, is it has reached a point where Ukraine intends to launch an offensive, but they're waiting for the weather to become better. If we take a look at the weather for Bakhmut as well as for Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia. There you go. If you look at Zaporizhia, it is rain until Thursday. And if you look at Bakhmut, it's rain until Friday. Let's check if there is like further 14 days. And we have this one, 10 days, 14 days. There you go. Yeah, okay, so we can see from Saturday and onwards, it's going to be without water, without rain. And here we'll see from Saturday onwards as well. So essentially Saturday onwards, so somewhere in the next week, we'll likely see the Ukrainians heavily prepare, if not proceed with their planned offensive. And why do I believe that they are planning and going ahead with this offensive? That is because we see here that the Russian forces are constantly advancing in Bakhmut, where they are essentially trying to take full control over the city. They're closing in on taking everything east of the rail lines, so that means that they'll have to move on to the western parts. And essentially, Bakhmut is a city that is significant because of its location. We have, if we look at the positions map, we have two major railways that is connected to Bakhmut. Both connect through the central area from the Dnipro, also through Kharkiv and all of these areas, through Slovyansk and down to Bakhmut. We have the ones from Dnipro to Pokrovsk and then down to Bakhmut. And we have from Kharkiv to Liman to Siversk and then to Bakhmut. So back when the Ukrainians controlled this whole area, Bakhmut was essentially, what do I say? It was the best supplied area on the whole front line. There's no other city here by the front that was as well supplied as Bakhmut. And at the same time, the Ukrainians knew this like 8 years ago, so they prepared a lot of defenses within the city. So Bakhmut is heavily fortified and it is well supplied. So it's essentially the biggest stronghold for the Ukrainian forces. The Russians have just shown that they're going through it, they're just storming it. And the Ukrainian side has said for months, Bakhmut will not fall, they'll hold Bakhmut at all costs. And that is literally what they're doing. They keep sending their troops to the very edge of the front line and tell them stay there until you achieve something. So that's the current situation in Bakhmut. So knowing that Bakhmut is closing in on falling as Russians control about 80% of the city, and at the same time the Ukrainian forces have promised that it will not fall, that means they have to do something to prevent it from falling. And the general situation on the whole front line is that the Russians constantly shell the Ukrainian positions, and they shell at a much higher rate than the Ukrainians do. The Russians shell 50,000 shells a day, somewhere between those two. And I know it's a large estimate, but that is just how much it differs. But yeah, so they shell in the tens of thousands, and then the Ukrainians shell like 5,000 at most every day. So the Russians are inflicting more casualties on the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians are doing on the Russians, simply based on that. And that is like, if you look at World War I, World War II, most casualties always were taken due to artillery shells. The artillery is the biggest killer of people in modern warfare history. From the Napoleonic era, as Napoleon was quoted to say, God stays with whoever has the best artillery or something in that regard. So essentially, like the Russians have such an artillery advantage that the Ukrainians are in a bad position generally because of that. And the current battle of attrition that the Russians are waging on the Ukrainians, that is not sustainable for the Ukrainians because the West does not produce enough ammunition for such an operation. They will always be outnumbered and outproduced by the Russians, as they're producing hundreds of thousands of shells every month compared to the West combined producing maybe at most 100,000 a month. So the West is being outproduced, they're out-stockpiled, and the Russians are just continuing this war of attrition because they know that is one they can win. They can win this war of attrition. If it continues like this, they will eventually win. It'll take a long time, but they will win. So the Ukrainians know this. They know that if they just continue as is, it's just a slow grind. They will lose. No matter what the West does, unless they actively engage in the combat themselves, the Ukrainians cannot win a battle of attrition. So they have to change the situation up. So what they are planning is to launch an offensive. If they force the Russians to fight them head on, then they can stop this war of attrition and maybe they can achieve something. Cutting off Melitopol, Berdyansk, and Mariupol, this area here, cutting off the land bridge between Russia and Crimea, could actually be very significant, because if they successfully do this, then they've essentially surrounded and cut off all the Russian forces in this whole area. That's upwards of 100,000 troops. That's a huge loss that doesn't take 2 seconds to replace. It'll be devastating for the Russians. So that is what the Ukrainians are aiming for. They want to launch some sort of offensive, cutting off the land bridge between Crimea and Russia, and taking advantage of that situation, force the Westerns to send a lot of weapons, airplanes, all of these things at once, instead of keep delaying it one by one, telling them, see, we can win. We are so much better than the Russians. We broke through. We did all of this, but it's still not enough. We need more weapons. We need all blah, 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 blah. And there you go. War goes on for another 3, 4, 5 years. So essentially, the Ukrainians are thinking, okay, our only possible solution to the current situation is we launch an offensive and we have to win that offensive. So that is why they are trying to... honestly, I don't know what they're trying to do right now. It seems like they're building some sort of force by Poltava, Kremenchuk, Dnipro, and so on, where they are trying to build up a force that that only specific mission for them is to break through and cut off the land bridge. While the Russians have just built fortification upon fortification upon fortification in the Zaporizhia region, essentially making it impossible for the Russian forces to defend. Essentially making it possible for the Ukrainian forces to break through. I misspoke. So the Russians know, okay, the Ukrainians are going to launch offensive, it's going to be here. But knowing the Ukrainians, they aren't just planning this. That would be the smart choice, to just put everything in one place. However, with the Russian defenses, it is very difficult for them to actually break through and cut this off. So the other option would be to break through the center. Just going straight through Donetsk to the north between Donetsk and Horlivka, and then just reaching the border and then going southwards and northwards. Going to Luhansk and cutting off Donetsk. That would be much more sensible. And the reason for that is the Russian forces are spread out across the front line and they're preparing for an offensive by the Ukrainians by Zaporizhia. That means that although they are continuously on the offensive here, it is not as strong as the Zaporizhia front, because the Zaporizhia, they're well rested, they're well prepared, all of these things, their fortifications are great. But here in the Donetsk region itself, in the center, all of the fortifications have already been demolished. They're fighting at mutual shelling, all of these things, they have to completely destroyed all of the fortifications. So the weakest point for the Russians is actually between Donetsk and Horlivka, or in this area south of Bakhmut and north of Horlivka. Either one of these two areas seem to be weaker than the others. So that might be exactly what the Ukrainians are preparing for. It could also be by the Vuhledar axis, or it could be all three of them. Essentially a full frontal assault in between the Vuhledar area and the Bakhmut area, and just launch like a huge frontal assault through all of this. Of course, the Russians can respond by attacking Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kharkiv, and all of these areas, and encircle the Ukrainians in return. But the Russians could end up being encircled themselves. Like, it is a very risky maneuver for both sides, but it is something that I believe would have a higher chance of actually working than a offensive against Zaporizhia, where the Russians have prepared defenses for like half a year by now, and they didn't do it like Ukraine, where they were on and off for 8 years, but actual intense, fully supported, fully equipped, fully trained, all of these things, defenses for 6 months. So essentially, we're seeing that there's a lot of information on gray zone warfare going on right now, because both sides are essentially trying to prevent the opponent from figuring out what they're actually doing, as to get like the moment of surprise that gives them the advantage. However, it is very difficult to actually come up with a surprise, with modern technology, with drones, satellite images, and so on. So whenever the Ukrainians gather up a force anywhere, the Russians just shell it heavily with their rockets, with their artillery, and so on. So honestly, I don't know what works and what doesn't work. It is very difficult to tell because of all of the gray zone, the gray area, the fog of war, all of these things that both sides just try their best to prevent anyone from figuring out their strengths and weaknesses. Like, so far we see that the Russian strength seems to be artillery, long-range attacks, trying to demolish the opponent's ability to wage war from a distance as they don't engage the enemy. And the Ukrainians seem to be that they are just capable of launching these highly mobile, gung-ho offensives where they just pour everything in and just advance. Or maybe it could be that the Russians are just completely destroying them as they advance, but they're just withdrawing as per their doctrine, and then they barely take any casualties. They lose a lot of land, but the Ukrainians are completely demolished, devastated. Like, for example, the Kharkiv offensive and the Kherson offensive. There was no fighting. No fighting happened. The Russians withdrew from Kherson and they withdrew from Kharkiv. There was no large surrender, all of these things. Yet for some reason, the Ukrainians were completely unable to launch an offensive for like half a year. It was from November to now, that's 5 months. In 5 months, the Ukrainians have been unable to launch an offensive. Why? Why did they need hundreds of new tanks, thousands of new armored vehicles from not fighting? They don't lose vehicles from advancing empty territory. This was all because the Russians heavily shelled these positions. So the Ukrainians barely had anything left after taking these areas, despite not giving despite the Russians barely taking any casualties because they just withdrew. They launched artillery strikes, launched airstrikes. But the Ukrainians took heavy casualties. How did that happen? That is because the Ukrainians are just in a situation where their estimate or their measurement of success is taking territory. So they'll do it at all costs. They'll prevent losing territory at all costs, and they'll take territory at all costs. Well, the Russians, they don't care about the territory. Like they withdraw only the strategically important territories, like Zaporizhia. That's very important, because cutting off this road would be so much more devastating than holding it. Like holding it, they could lose 50,000 troops by a very strong Ukrainian offensive, but losing it would lose them 100,000 troops. So fighting is so much more worth it than withdrawing. But in Kharkiv and in Kherson, withdrawing was so much better than fighting, because fighting, they could have lost all of their troops. They could have lost 50,000 in Kharkiv and Kherson combined. But instead, they lost like 1,000. That is just a random number I put out there, but essentially, that is the idea. The Russians have barely taken casualties compared to the Ukrainians. And if you look at any estimate besides the Ukrainian and Western ones, because they are very obviously biased, and generally neutral countries don't come with estimates, but if you look at neutral YouTubers like History Legends, his estimates were the Ukrainians took like 4 to 5 times as many casualties as the Russians. My own estimate would be the same, 4 to 5 times as many. For every one Russian soldier lost, 5 Ukrainians. And that's terrible. That is horrible, especially when the Russian population is 145 million. The Ukrainian population was 45 million. They have lost about 10 million because of the territorial losses. They've lost another 10 million because of the refugees. So that's like 25 million left. 25 to 145, that's 6 times as many. So that's like 25 casualties to each one Russian casualty. And just saying that out loud, that is extremely, extremely terrible for one side. So, in conclusion, the Ukrainians are in a very, very bad position, and the Russians are in a very normal position. Like they aren't exactly having fun killing a lot of Ukrainians, but they aren't really that poor position either. And I think that is all I have as a presentation. I can go on for like 5 more minutes or so. So I'll try going on the Patreon page as well as YouTube and see if anyone is joining. This one was posted, so okay, yeah, it's going live. And let's look on YouTube. Community tab. Let's see. Copy link address. Members only stream live on phone. Oh yeah, it is Easter today, so I believe there's probably a lot who cannot join. The archived part. But if you're free, come and join. That is all channel members. And what else is there? I saw History Legends just uploaded a video. I guess something we could do is that we could react to his video. Sure, let's do that.
Who is the intern? You didn't pay to make this map.
Where would France be?
And we have to... Okay, let's do this. And if I copy this. There we go.
Without its colonies.
Probably wealthier.
It was a successful insurrection by self-liberated enslaved people against French colonial rule in Saint-Domingue.
No, not really.
Statues of white men need to colonize. My god, I almost forgot. Haiti
too much
literally
work.
had this racist imperialist past.
You were the chosen one! It was said that you would destroy this and not join them!
Hello my friends and welcome to History Legends. Today we'll be reacting to this video called How France's Colonial Past Explains Its Racism Today. No spoilers, it looks promising. Essentially, we're talking about woke activists that live in France, very important fact, that rewrite history because they're broke and they want your cash.
It's why there are growing calls for France to recognize and
Thank you, I
apologize
want your
for its
cash as
violent
well.
colonization of millions of
good.
people in Africa and Asia.
Spain is still waiting for an apology for the 800-year-long Muslim occupation of their land. As a matter of fact, Vienna could also demand apologies from Turkey for the Ottoman siege of Vienna not once, but twice. But do you see the Austrians ask for an apology? No, because the Turks would look at them and say, Wallahi Kardesh, Turkey army number one. We can come anytime. If
Honestly, I never understood the idea of asking for reparation or apologies and all of that stuff. First of all, it happened hundreds of years ago, so none of the guys who actually did any of that stuff isn't alive. Second thing is you cannot project the values of today into the values of the past. Back then, we saw wars all the time, anytime, all of these things. And we don't see that today, so we keep complaining, oh my god, this and that, occupation, colonization, slavery, we need apologies and compensation. No, you don't. You literally do not need it. It is a nice to have. I would love it if I got compensation or whatever from the United States for occupying, or Germany from occupying Denmark in 1941 to 1945. But do you see me go around begging for compensation for the occupation of Denmark in 1941 to 1945? No, I don't, because I don't think that makes logically sense. It makes no sense. But Poland asks for compensation from Germany, so they disagree with me.
we come, Halle bye bye Austrian army.
Let's take a look at France's historic colonial crimes to understand the conversations on race happening today, and why the French elite say no when it comes to acknowledging its racist imperialist past.
In their ideology, colonialism is by default a crime. So when woke activists mention colonial crimes, they lose their minds. Same thing goes for racist imperialism. However, the golden rule is that it's only racist imperialism when a white country does it. Otherwise, it's chill. It's just part of a country's right to expand beyond its borders, and it's just part of history.
Honestly, I think make it even for everyone. You cannot be racist, imperialist, evil, crime, colonialist, whatever he said they were saying about the past. Everything is just the past. Like, we study it, we don't use it to argue for compensation or apologies. We're just sitting here, relaxing, chilling, and all we want, all we really want is, well, basically, I believe the reason they're asking for this is because they're greedy. Like they could argue, because of what happened 100 years ago, my great-great-grandfather was in this country in Nigeria, and the British occupied it. I don't remember it was French or British, but either or. They occupied us, and because of that, we had generations of wealth stolen from us. If you go to the British Museum, you see a lot of our artifacts there and all of these heritage things. It's like, you most likely do not even live there, and if you do live there, then you have way more things to worry about. And even if that's not the case, you're just sitting there, you're enjoying life, but you realize that you could have had more, well, then work for it, like everyone else. It's not like the average British person or the average French person is enjoying. Well, maybe you could argue that they are enjoying because of the welfare and all of these things. But if you look at it from a normal perspective, you could see that Europe is actually in demise right now and Africa is on the rise. So if you just relax for like 50, 100 years, then the positions will be reversed and you'll probably be the one colonizing the Europeans. So just hold down, and for next few generations, just teach them you need to be colonizers so that you can colonize Europe, so you can avenge our great-great-grandparents. See, that's the best solution. There you go.
Of course, because white people are evil. For example, Malians take great pride in the Mali Empire that grew through military conquest and subjugated all neighboring kingdoms, without even mentioning Mansa Musa and his thousands of slaves. And it's not until the arrival of the French troops in Mali that slavery and human sacrifices were abolished.
Let's start at the 17th century when the French colonized the Americas. North American colonies became known as New France.
If you're going to denounce French imperialism, at least do it with facts. Who is the intern you didn't pay to make this map? Not only do I have to react to this video, I have to fix this video. So the French also settled in Guyana. They also had this region, Acadia, for a long time, as well as part of Newfoundland. And if I'm very picky, the French also controlled the island of Trinidad. Notice how almost all the Caribbean islands were French at some point in time. There were as many French settlers in the Caribbean, roughly 54,000 people from France, as in all of North America from New Orleans to Acadia. And from a military perspective, it just makes sense because islands are much easier to defend than the huge swath of land of North America filled with hostile natives and English settlers.
The French colonized parts of the Caribbean. This included
I can't say anything, he's just covering it very well.
Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti. It grew to be the richest sugar colony because of the labor of enslaved Africans.
No!
Yes, because the slaves there made the best quality sugar that you've ever seen in your life.
Very well. Where do I begin?
Saint-Domingue did not simply become rich because of slave labor. If slave labor alone was synonymous of wealth, why were African kingdoms at the time so poor? After all, they're the ones that gathered all these millions of slaves that they captured from enemy tribes, which meant that they had an almost infinite pool of slave labor. They could have kept them all and just become super rich.
Wakanda forever!
If slave labor was so profitable, why did they resort to selling millions of their African brothers to the Arabs and then to the Europeans?
So what he's gonna say? Well, let's just hear him say it.
Truth is, Saint-Domingue was a capitalist wet dream. This colony that was not even an island but a small part of an island became the biggest producer of sugar in the world. But what made it rich is actually coffee. Saint-Domingue produced half the coffee on the entire world market. This tiny bit of land the size of New Jersey was exporting more than the newly independent United States. According to the 1790 census, there were 700,000 slaves in the US out of a total of nearly 4 million inhabitants. At the same time, in Saint-Domingue, the census reported 400,000 slaves out of 500,000 inhabitants. With the less slave labor, Saint-Domingue managed to outperform the United States. The main reason
Okay, so
behind the economical success of the colony is that France massively invested to build infrastructure, mainly through private investors that paid for highly technological machinery that was brought and built on the island. There were roughly 7,000 factories and mills of all kinds for the production and transformation of the sugarcane, coffee, and other products. On average, there was one factory every 2.5 football fields. And this over-exploitation of the land was multiplied by a massive workforce. In the end, there were thousands of ships coming in and out of the ports of Saint-Domingue. And that's how you get the richest colony of the Americas.
The French also
okay, so not just that, you have to think about it this way. If you just build a lot of infrastructure in Europe or in Africa, you still wouldn't get the same amount of sugar and coffee production as they had in Saint-Domingue. The reason why it was so successful there and why they even bothered to sail half across the whole ocean to get there is because the land there was optimal for the plantation of sugar and coffee. And how many wealthy Europeans can you get, or poor for that sake, can you get to work across the ocean? Like, not a lot of people actually wanted to go there. And if they actually went there, then slavery at the time was normal. So why not have slaves work while you just reap the benefits of it? So wealthy Europeans would buy land in these areas and then invest heavily into the infrastructure and the mechanisms and so on. And countries as a whole, like France, Britain, they would they owned these areas, they claimed these areas, sent troops to defend them, and then they invested themselves as a country, officially invested and built and so on. And from that, they reaped huge benefits. They took a lot of profits from these plantations and islands and so on. So generally, what happened? They were reaping benefits from slave labor, yes, but it's not because it was slave labor. If it was anyone else working, then they would have achieved the same success. The difference is they didn't pay the workers; they just let them live there. And well, sometimes they died from overwork and all of that. I'm not saying that slavery is fine. Slavery is terrible, especially the way they treated the slaves. That was terrible. However, it's not you could say the slaves were replaceable. It's not because of the slaves that it succeeded. It was because of the fertility of the land and the investments of the countries and wealthy people, and then by the hands of the slaves, it came to fruition. But essentially anyone could have worked there. Native people, the settlers and so on. They would just have gotten a wage instead. And they would probably have had to ask for more workers' rights. But again, how many workers' rights were there in the 15th century? Not a lot. Or well, 16th, 17th century.
established trading settlements across the coast of India. In the middle of the 18th century, France and Britain got into colonial conflicts. Much of France's first empire was destroyed.
Add some freaking dates for the audience. First collapse 1763 as a result of the 7 Years' War. How, you ask me? Without a proper navy, you can't really secure your colonies, especially when your nemesis is the Royal Navy. And as a result, the French lost all of its colonies in North America and India, apart from little trading posts. France essentially sacrificed these huge colonies just to keep some of the Caribbean islands. Now, as you saw with Saint-Domingue, these remaining colonies were still extremely profitable, which made the British extremely jealous. And then, round two. So the second collapse happened in the years of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The upheaval of the revolution knocked down the flourishing French Royal Navy, and the massive repression campaign forced 90% of the captains to flee abroad. The British took advantage of Napoleon's campaigns all over Europe to take over all the remaining French colonies. More often,
So basically, while war was waging on in Europe, Britain was off in the ocean, taking everything French-owned across the world, and the French were too busy surviving and beating up the rest of Europe, including Prussia, Austria, Spain, France, and Italy. Or, well, at that time it was essentially a mix of different nations that were not united under one Italian nation. That happened way later, like actually not that much later, like 50 years after the Napoleonic Wars, if I remember correctly.
than
Somewhere around
not,
there.
with the help of French royalist plantation owners that also despised the Republic and its ideals of freedom.
But it didn't take long for French empire building to continue. France invaded Algeria in 1830.
Oh no! Come on! They make it seem as if the French were on some sort of colonial roid rage. Need to colonize.
Honestly, great video by History Legends. I'm not going to continue, as essentially I believe it's less important to talk about all the things they get wrong, but rather why they get these things wrong. Because what they're essentially doing is oversimplifying history to fit their agenda, and their agenda being that they want reparations and support and apologies for the past of France and Britain and so on. I believe, I mean, sure, go for it if that's what you want to do, but there's like no benefits to it. Doesn't benefit anyone. All it does is it makes debate, talks about how people were evil in the past. Sure, that's no secret. All I can say is that I can't be bothered to join in on that, as I don't see any benefits to doing it. I would much rather focus on what we can improve from history, because that is why I study history. I study history because I believe it is very important to know and understand what happens in history, rather than focus on what was good and bad. We have to focus on what will be good or bad to do today. And for example, one of those things we can learn from history that would be good today is that war isn't won by people on the field. It is won by the table where you make deals, peace deals. And why isn't that happening? That is because both sides believe that they can gain more from fighting than they can gain from a peace deal. So they'll continue fighting until the war is determined on the battlefield. But again, that doesn't make sense. Why would you wait until war is determined by the battlefield? That is because you are blind to reality. And if we look at history, we could tell that the reality is that Ukraine has no freaking chance at this. And honestly, they're just wasting their breath, and they should probably look for a peace deal. Although it will not be perfect, it is better than sacrificing more men and more economy and so on. And I believe that is all for the stream. I don't see anyone who's joined the stream, so I'll just end it here for this week. And then hopefully next week, when it is not Easter, then hopefully some others will join and we can get to it properly. But yeah, for next week I'll prepare something. I'll make a presentation of some sort or something similar. And if anyone arrives, then I can do some communication. We can talk together, whether you want to talk live with me face to face, or if you just want to type in the chat and I'll respond. We can do a Q&A, something like that, whatever you want. And that's gonna be it for today. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.